Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader and today we're going to talk about the latest issue of Foreign Affairs. So I've known about Foreign Affairs for a few years now and I've gotten a couple of issues previously, but when I got those issues I never actually read them out. So this was my first issue of Foreign Affairs that I read completely. I read all the essays and I also read the review essays. I skipped the mini book reviews and I didn't read the ads, but apart from that I read this complete issue of Foreign Affairs, which, excluding the ads and the mini book reviews, I would say it's about 150 to 200 pages of reading material. There are about 11 essays in this issue and also 3 review essays. And this Foreign Affairs issue has a theme of dictators, so it focuses a lot on China and Russia, which I found very interesting. It has a clear neoliberal bent in international relations, which I favor, and it's clearly pro-West for the most part. And while it is neoliberal in the IR sense, it is not that economically liberal, unfortunately. So there's a clear statist bent here. Although you don't have unity among these articles, there's a spectrum of opinions here. You do have some general trends, and it is clearly in favor of some sorts of statism. For example, that the IMF should be intervening by giving a bunch of loans and then have things like loan forgiveness, or that the governments in the United States or the EU need to become more active to become more competitive as economies. So those things I don't necessarily agree with. But I really loved the articles on Russia and China, and there are several of them in this book, and they are very critical of these countries. So I thought I would go through briefly what each article talks about in this latest Foreign Affairs issue. So the first article basically says that détente between the US and China will fail. So in the author's view in this essay, détente is always a temporary thing for the weaker power between the two competitors to catch up, and then you have real conflict start. So the United States and China don't really have a convergence of interest. So according to this author, they won't successfully be able to cooperate that well on international matters such as climate change because of different perceptions and national interests, and they have contradicting ideologies. So the United States seeks to export liberal democracy and openness, while China wants to dominate the region. And China also has a view that the United States is in decline, but it's also very skeptical of the West, since they remember the century of humiliation, which is why any good faith discussion you try to have with China, it will be looked on suspiciously by the Chinese. So this article is basically arguing that you will have a Cold War between China and the United States and that they will be enduring rivals, which I do agree with. Then the next article is on AI and its power and the danger of this and how government can solve this, and it's by E.M. Bremer among other authors. And he basically argues that if the government does not intervene and regulate, then AI is going to go out of control and erode sovereignty, as if that's a bad thing, and it will cause big problems somehow. And he basically says government needs to work with the big tech giants, but at the same time regulate a lot. I would not agree with the over-regulation of the AI stuff, since a lot of problems we have in tech nowadays is from over-regulation, which creates oligopolies. For example, caring about this thing with disinformation, that's not a thing for democratic governments to care about or determine what is disinformation. And the thing is, with private companies, they are private, which means they don't have coercive power. So him viewing AI as a big danger, no, I don't agree. I would understand if he would have a specific focus on cybersecurity. That would make sense. And he basically argues that AI cannot be stopped, but it needs to be constrained, which I'm skeptical of that argument. Next is 2 articles on Russia. So one is basically that Putin, with the war in Ukraine, he has created chaos. And the second idea is that this is the end of the Russian idea. So with the war in Ukraine, Putin has shown himself that he's not an invincible leader that always wins in his wars, because he won in Georgia, he kind of won in Ukraine in 2014, he won against the oligarchs in the early 2000s, and also he won in Chechnya, but now he's actually kind of failing in the Ukraine war. And these articles kind of imply you may have a downfall of Putin, and one article kind of argues, okay, so you may have a new liberalizing phase in Russia, but whenever you have a liberalizing phase in Russia, it fails in the long run and you have return to authoritarianism. So for example, the removal of the Tsar resulted in the liberal Kerensky government, but eventually they were replaced by the communist dictatorship of Lenin. Same thing when Stalin died, you had Khrushchev, which kind of liberalized politically the Soviet Union partially, but then you had Brezhnev who came in and was more repressive. And the thing is, all of these reforms, they're kind of halfway measures, they're never enough. So what may replace Putin may kind of work in the short run but won't work in the long run. Then there's another article that argues basically now with the Ukraine war, the younger elites in Russia who are much more nationalistic and war driven and jingoistic are replacing the more conservative types in Russia who hate the West but are not that strong in actually influencing things on the scene. It's some weird article discussing the power struggle now within Putin's circle. The next article is about how China is stagnating due to self-imposed isolation and that economic growth is quickly slowing. So this is true in a sense, especially with COVID. They closed the entire economy down, but afterwards when they opened it up again, the growth nowadays is no longer driven by consumers and investors. It's much more government driven, and clearly economic growth is rapidly slowing down in China. And the government in China under Xi is becoming both more and more authoritarian and more statist also. So that's another reason for slowed economic growth. Another article talks about this and how this is kind of the end of the Chinese economic miracle. Next article basically argues that with increasing protectionism, the severity of the economic shocks will be worse, and you will have, and the rapid decline in poverty you've seen up till now, that will stop or slow down severely, because less free trade means less efficiency in the markets, which means less development for poor countries. The next article talks about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and how the debt schemes they've set up in different countries in the third world is now falling apart, and that now the IMF has to come in. It talks about African countries, I think like Zambia, for example, and I think it maybe mentions also Albania. And this article basically argues for that, okay, we need to renegotiate the loans, so some debt forgiveness possibly, but also we need to demand more transparency with Chinese loans and basically make countries pick, okay, either you have the IMF loan or the Chinese loan. Because the IMF loan has a lot more standards in what you can spend your money on, while the Chinese loan, it doesn't care if you spend your money inefficiently, which of course racks up debt. Because if you don't spend your money from debt-based efficiently, then you're not making growth, which means you don't have the ability to pay back the debt. So I would agree with the part for more transparency. But this thing with debt forgiveness, no, because debt forgiveness creates a moral hazard incentive. Because when you forgive debt, you're encouraging bad behavior again by governments to take out bad debt again. The next article is an article basically saying that, okay, you're having technology used in this Ukraine war, but technology won't cause a breakthrough for either Russia or Ukraine. And this has been true throughout all modern wars. They have not been game-changing in the long run, really. Because when you introduce a new technology, the other side adapts, and they are often able to countenance that technology with their own technology or to jam it. And then the next article is about how the EU is starting to place geopolitics above markets, and that it's good, and that they're going to intervene more because they can't trust what China and the United States does. So I do understand the idea of more protectionism towards China, since they are a geopolitical threat, but the same thing is not true with the United States. So the argument for having a split economically between the EU and the United States, I don't agree with. And also it's basically saying that austerity and capitalism and free markets that Germany has been preaching with the ECB has failed, which that's a total misreading of the situation, in my opinion, since a lot of these economic crises and problems are not tied with free markets. They're tied to markets that had heavy government intervention. And then the final article is about how the United States should interact with Erdogan. And this article basically argues that Erdogan, while he does have his ideology of a greater Turkey and all of that, and increasing authoritarianism and putting Islam above interest and whatever, and caring more about Turkish geopolitical interest over NATO's interest, and playing brinkmanship, where pushing the edge, where you're allied officially with NATO but then you're screwing around with Russia. This author basically claims that, okay, Erdogan is trying to push the limits, but if you're firm with him, he stops screwing around. So you had Erdogan who bought military technology from Russia, and in response, the United States basically said, okay, our sanction is you don't get to buy American military technology, which led Erdogan to back down and accept, okay, I won't use the Russian military technology. Those were the articles in Foreign Affairs. Of course, there were some review articles. They were kind of interesting, but I'm not going to talk about them here. And I didn't bother reading the book reviews since there's 30 different mini book reviews in this issue. I don't know how many, dozens and dozens of book reviews. So I'm not going to read all of that, especially when it's only like about 3 paragraphs per book review. Foreign Affairs ends with an extract from an essay in the previous Foreign Affairs articles. This one ends basically with something by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who's looking at Soviet rule in the 50s and basically claims that, okay, any change in communist Russia, in the dynamics of the power situation, will destroy the grip of communist power in the long run, which did happen about 30 years after this article was written. So yeah, those were some brief thoughts on the different articles in this latest Foreign Affairs issue. And based on my reading, would I recommend Foreign Affairs as a journal that you should read? Yeah, you learn a lot of interesting stuff going on in recent international relations here. And the theme here was the desperation of dictators, so it focused a lot on China and Russia specifically. So next issue maybe it will be less interesting, but at least this issue I do not regret at all reading Foreign Affairs. It has, I would say, a center-left neoliberal bias overall, so it's a bias that I partially agree with, partially disagree with. But it's a stimulating read. So if you want to learn about up-to-date international relations, then maybe you should check out Foreign Affairs. If you want to learn about how China and Russia fit in to modern energy geopolitics, then you should check out my book review of The New Map by Daniel Jürgen. I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.